My name is Amanda, I'm 32 years old, and I never imagined that supporting the person I loved most in my family would leave me heartbroken and with a bitter lesson I still struggle to accept. Since I was a child, I was always the one who shouldered the responsibility, the one who sacrificed my dreams so others could shine. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the day I decided to lend my sister the money she needed for her wedding, only to discover, some time later, that I wasn't even invited to the event she'd promised me I'd be the most important person to. Perhaps you've been there too, in that place where you feel like you've given everything, and when you most need recognition or just a thank you, you realize you simply don't matter. Where the love you gave, the support you gave, becomes an invisible burden, something others simply ignore or dismiss as if it never existed. Have you ever been made to feel disposable? As if you were a mere passenger in someone else's story, a resource to be used and discarded mercilessly? Because that's exactly the story I want to tell today. Throughout my life, I've struggled to maintain a balance between love and pain, between hope and the harshest reality. And although I wanted to believe that my sister and I would always have that indestructible bond, the truth is that some relationships break silently, with empty promises and decisions that cut deeper than any fight or argument. What came after I lent her that money not only shocked me, but showed me that sometimes the people you help the most are the ones who cast you aside the quickest. I want you, as you listen to my story, to think about all those times you gave something valuable to someone, and that person not only didn't appreciate it, but made you feel invisible. How do you overcome something like that? How do you move forward when the pain comes from those who were supposed to be by your side, supporting you, and recognizing your efforts? This story isn't just mine. It's the story of everyone who has felt their love and dedication were taken as a favor and not an act of true commitment. So, if you've ever felt used, ignored, or replaced, I invite you to stay with me and learn everything that happened behind the perfect wedding I was never invited to celebrate. For as long as I can remember, the dynamic in our family was this unequal, almost as if we were playing roles assigned to us without either of us having a choice. My sister was always the princess, the spoiled one, the shining star who received attention without having to put in much effort. From small things, like which dish to choose at the table or who could stay up later, to important decisions, she always had a privileged place. The family looked at her with eyes full of admiration and unconditional affection, as if everything she did was perfect and worthy of celebration. And then there was me, Amanda, the responsible one, the serious one, the one who always had to live up to expectations. I was the one who had to run errands, the one who had to get good grades in school, the one who took care of my younger siblings when the adults were busy. I remember those looks from my mother and father, who sometimes seemed more tired or demanding of me, as if they expected me to be the one who maintained order and stability, with no room for mistakes or even asking for help. While my sister received praise for every little thing, I felt like my efforts went unnoticed, as if they were simply taken for granted. It wasn't just the big family events or important decisions. It was in the small details where favoritism was most evident. I remember that when it came to dividing up household chores, my sister managed to avoid almost everything, while I always ended up with the heaviest responsibilities. When we talked about plans or vacations, she always received special gifts or surprises, and I was relegated to the background, almost invisible. Over time, those small differences turned into a mountain of accumulated emotions, resentments, and a deep sense of not really belonging, of always being the one who was extra. And not only did I feel unappreciated, but every time I tried to express what I felt or ask for a little more recognition, I was met with looks that didn't understand my frustration or comments that made me feel selfish for wanting attention. My sister, on the other hand, could do anything and always found someone to defend or justify her, as if her mistakes were minimal or simply didn't matter. This disparity created a silent gap between us that no one dared to mention, but that I felt with every heartbeat. I grew up with that inner voice telling me that no matter how much I did, it would never be enough, that there would always be a special place for her, and that I should settle for the rest. That voice accompanied me through every stage of my life, through every challenge, through every sacrifice I made, thinking that one day I would be recognized for what I gave. But the truth was that this unequal dynamic became so ingrained in our family that it became part of our daily reality, a pattern that was difficult to break and even harder to accept. In that environment, my love and support for my sister didn't diminish. On the contrary, they grew because, despite everything, I always wanted to see her happy and succeed. But the imbalance was there, like a shadow that marked every interaction, every decision, every important moment. And without realizing it, that inequality was laying the foundations for a much more complicated story, where one person's sacrifice was another's comfort, and where affection seemed to be measured in favoritism and silent exclusions. From a very young age, I learned that the world isn't always fair, and that often, those who work and sacrifice the most are those who receive the least recognition. While my sister enjoyed a seemingly carefree life, full of privileges and ease, I was burdened with responsibilities that, although no one explicitly asked me to, I felt I had to assume to keep our family afloat, or at least to fill those voids that no one else seemed willing or able to fill. I clearly remember my first jobs. I started working right after high school, looking for any opportunity to save and contribute a little to the family, even though it was almost never enough. I carefully saved every penny I earned, aware that, sooner or later, someone in the family would need it. And often that someone was myself, because in addition to my responsibilities as a daughter, sister, and student, I also had to handle unexpected situations. Medical emergencies, paying rent when others failed to pay, and school expenses that seemed to multiply out of control. While my sister lived surrounded by comfort and support, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders, without anyone noticing how difficult it was to maintain that precarious balance. It wasn't just a financial sacrifice, but also an emotional and physical one. I worked long hours, studied at night, and took care of others when necessary, always with a smile on my face, without complaining, because I knew no one would thank me or acknowledge those efforts. It was almost as if I were a wild card, a standby person who could be called upon when times got tough, but who didn't deserve a regular seat at the table or a sincere thank you. The reality was that my financial support was vital for my sister to be able to study without worry, to have a roof over her head and clean clothes, to be able to get ahead without major obstacles. But that support was invisible, ignored, as if it were an obligation I had to fulfill without the right to receive anything in return. And while she enjoyed her moments of fun and freedom, I continued to accumulate hours of work and sleepless nights, always hoping that one day things would change, that the sacrifice would make sense, and that, finally, someone would recognize my efforts. It was an exhausting cycle, a silent routine that kept me going despite my exhaustion, a constant struggle to prove that I too deserved to be valued and respected. But instead of gratitude, I often received indifference, even reproaches for not being more understanding, or for not letting my sister enjoy her life. The paradox was painful. The more I gave, the less it seemed to matter, and the more I sacrificed, the more I was made to feel that I wasn't enough for the family I was helping to support. Along the way, I understood that my sacrifice wasn't just financial, but also involved giving up my own dreams, moments of personal happiness, the opportunity to rest and simply be. But despite everything, I never stopped loving my sister, or believing she deserved a place in her life and in our family. What I didn't know at the time was that this silent sacrifice would be only the beginning of a much more complex story, where unconditional support isn't always reciprocated, and where loyalty sometimes becomes a burden that can break you inside. When my sister announced she was getting married, it was a moment of pure happiness for her, an event she eagerly awaited and saw as the culmination of a dream come true. For the entire family, it seemed like an important occasion, worthy of celebration with great pomp and detail, an event that would put my sister, the undisputed princess of the family, and her future husband at the center of attention. At that moment, my heart filled with a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, I felt genuine joy because I wanted to see her happy, but on the other, a lump formed in my throat at the thought of the financial complications such an event would entail, not only for her, but for me as well. Despite having my own debts and responsibilities, I didn't hesitate for a second to lend her thousands of dollars so that the wedding wouldn't be canceled. For me, it was important to be that support that I knew no one else in the family was willing to offer. I remember long conversations in which she detailed every plan, every decision, every whim she wanted to include in the celebration, and how I, from my silent place, absorbed every word, hoping that this time, at least this once, she would acknowledge everything I was doing for her. The promises she made me in those conversations still resonate in my mind. "Amanda, don't worry, I'll pay you back. You are a vital part of this wedding. It wouldn't be the same without you. This is just the beginning of all the good things to come for us." Words that, at the time, filled me with hope and made me feel for the first time like someone indispensable, someone truly valued in the close circle of our family. We cried together on several occasions, and although those tears seemed sincere, deep down I felt I was giving away more than I could really give, and that this debt was not only financial but also emotional. While she enjoyed preparing for her wedding, I struggled to balance my finances, working overtime, and juggling to cover my own expenses while supporting this grand event that promised to be my sister's dream. There was no room for doubt or selfishness. I was there to fulfill my role, to be the invisible pillar that would make everything perfect for her. It was as if my entire life revolved around her happiness, and I accepted that without question, because that's how I was taught to be: strong, responsible, and self-sacrificing. What I didn't understand at the time was that this great support would also be the toughest test for our relationship, because behind that apparent unity and gratitude, there was an imbalance that was slowly beginning to fracture. While I carried the pressure of debt and responsibility, my sister seemed to be drifting away, making decisions without consulting me, avoiding discussing when and how she would repay me, and paying more attention to the celebrations and the image she wanted to project than to the person holding the financial roof over her head for that wedding. In the midst of all this, I tried to remain steadfast, convinced that the sacrifice would be worth it, that the emotional and financial investment wouldn't be in vain, and that in the end, our relationship as sisters and as a family would be strengthened. But the reality was that this support, so great and sincere on my part, was the beginning of a series of disagreements and wounds that would forever mark our history. Because those who give don't always expect to receive, and sacrifice isn't always appreciated or reciprocated. There were just a few days left until the wedding, and my heart was still full of hope, thinking that finally all the effort and support I had given would be rewarded, that my presence would be indispensable for my sister at one of the most important moments of her life. But then, like an unexpected and cold blow, came the message that changed everything. A short, dry message, without explanation or a single hint of emotion, informing me that I wasn't invited to the wedding. "It will be something intimate," they said, as if trying to soften the wound, as if that excuse could justify the exclusion of someone who had been fundamental to the celebration even happening. But despite that attempt at explanation, something inside me irreparably broke. Disbelief and pain mingled into a bitter feeling that left me paralyzed for a few moments, as if the ground beneath my feet were opening up and slowly swallowing me. I tried not to give it too much thought, thinking it might be a misunderstanding or an inevitable change of plans. But then, reality hit me hard when, just a few hours later, I started seeing photos and videos on social media. Photos of my sister, radiant and smiling, posing with dozens of guests, all happy, all celebrating together on the day I'd been told would be intimate. Photos that showed a room packed with family, friends, and acquaintances, a full-blown party that I had helped finance with my own money and that now seemed like a spectacle from which I had been deliberately erased. Rage began to burn in my chest, an intense fire that made me want to scream, cry, and demand answers right away, but I chose to remain silent. I chose to remain silent because in that moment I realized that a public confrontation or a fight would do me no good, as it would only leave me exhausted and hurt. I kept that pain and betrayal inside me, a heavy burden I carried in silence, letting the disappointment become a constant shadow that followed me wherever I went. That silence, though painful, was my way of protecting myself, of not falling into despair or blind rage. But it was also the beginning of an internal process of reflection and strength, a path that would lead me to understand that a person's worth is not measured by inclusion in a party or by the recognition of others, but by the dignity with which they face injustice and the ability to move forward without losing their true essence. During those days after the wedding, I watched as my sister received congratulations, gifts, and affection from everyone, while I remained on the sidelines, invisible to those who had previously asked me for help. The betrayal hurt not only because I was excluded from the event, but because it was a clear statement that for them, I was expendable, someone they could use and then discard without remorse. But today, after all that silence and pent-up rage, I've decided to tell this story. Because no one deserves to feel discarded, and because sometimes the deepest pain transforms into the greatest force to change the course of our lives. This isn't just my story of betrayal, It's the story of many people who have given their all only to be forgotten and replaced. After that unbearable pain I felt when I was left out of the wedding, when I understood that for my own flesh and blood, I was just another resource, someone they could use and then ignore without the slightest remorse, something inside me changed forever. It wasn't a violent or immediate change, nor was I seeking outright revenge with screaming or explosive confrontations. No, what began to grow inside me was a silent vengeance, a seed of strength that germinated with patience and strategy, fueled by disappointment, yes, but also by the desire to protect myself and regain the respect I should never have lost. At first, I simply distanced myself a little, trying not to get more involved than necessary, but I couldn't let it be like that. I couldn't allow them to simply walk all over me. Then I began to be careful, taking note of every expense I had made to help my sister, every payment I had made when she couldn't, every favor they had asked of me that I had fulfilled without question. I began collecting receipts, contracts, bank transactions, any tangible evidence that would prove that, even though they had erased me from their lives and their celebrations, I had been there, supporting, sustaining, and building part of what they now took for granted. This compilation wasn't a coincidence, nor something done in a fit of rage. It was a meticulous, almost obsessive process, because I understood that this evidence would be my shield and my weapon, my way of proving that I wasn't invisible, that I couldn't be ignored or trampled on without consequences. Each receipt was a reminder of my sacrifices, each contract a sign of my commitment, and each bank transfer a testament that these hadn't been just words or empty promises, but real, incontestable deeds. But not only that, I also began to cut the financial ties that bound us. I stopped lending money, doing financial favors, and intervening when things got complicated. It was painful because for years I had been the one who had shouldered those responsibilities, the one who had been there when no one else wanted or could help. But it was also liberating because for the first time I felt I was regaining control of my life and my resources. I was no longer going to be anyone's crutch, nor the safe where they kept their debts and problems. Emotionally, I also began to protect myself. I limited conversations, visits, and even texts. It wasn't out of resentment, although I admit the wound was deep, but rather a need to preserve my peace of mind, to set clear boundaries so I wouldn't continue to be a victim of an unbalanced family system that didn't value my efforts or my love. And although it hurt, I learned to say no, to not always be available, to not open the door when the knock was only to ask for more and give less. This silent revenge wasn't about destroying anyone, but about building my own space, my dignity, and my independence. It was a way of saying, without words, that I was no longer going to allow myself to be the invisible shadow, the joker they turned to when it suited them and then discarded without hesitation. My silence and my actions spoke for me, much louder than any argument or reproach. So, little by little, I strengthened my position, quietly gaining ground, with the calm of someone who knows that patience is a powerful weapon. And while they continued in their world of parties, deception, and exclusion, I prepared for a future where my voice, my rights, and my worth would be respected, even if it meant alienating them forever. After months of keeping my distance, setting clear boundaries, and taking care of myself, reality began to show cracks in the perfect facade my sister and her husband had built. It wasn't a dramatic or immediate collapse, but a slow and painful unraveling that made me see, once again, how life can take unexpected turns. They, who had once lived carefree lives, always confident that I would be there to support them, now faced financial problems they couldn't hide or disguise. I remember the first time I heard her voice pleading for help, a call I received without warning, and that paralyzed me for a moment. It was her, my sister, the same one who had left me out of her wedding, the one who had ignored my sacrifices, pleading with a humility I'd never seen before. "Amanda, just this once, please, we need one last helping hand. We're going through a difficult time and we don't know who else to turn to." That plea pierced my soul because it was a reminder of everything that had been and what was now at stake. But this time, something in me had changed. I wasn't the Amanda of old, who gave her money, her time, and her heart unconditionally. This time, my answer wasn't an automatic yes, nor a promise of unconditional help. It was a response with boundaries, with strength, with the clarity of someone who'd learned to value herself and never let herself be trampled on again. I told them that I understood their situation, that I felt how difficult it could be to go through this, but that I could no longer be the easy solution to their problems. I explained, with a firm but hate-free voice, that for years I had been the one who had supported them, the one who had paid bills, rent, tuition, and emergencies, while they lived carefree. I reminded them that there had come a time when I needed to take care of myself, that I couldn't continue sacrificing myself while they took everything for granted. And although I knew that truth would hurt, I spoke it because it was time to stop. That call was the beginning of a new chapter, where the power to resolve their crises was no longer in my hands. From that moment on, my sister and her husband had to face the consequences of their decisions, learning to manage their own problems without depending on me. It was hard to watch them struggle, how that facade of security slowly crumbled, but it was also liberating for me, because I understood that it was no longer my burden or my responsibility. Of course, there were moments of doubt, of remorse for not being able or willing to help more, but I quickly pushed them away. Because in the midst of all the pain and betrayal, I learned that self-love and self-respect are indispensable, and that sometimes the best help you can offer is to teach others to stand on their own 2 feet, even if it means letting them fall. This new phase was a rebirth for me. I learned that it's not necessary to sacrifice your well-being for others, especially when those others don't value your efforts or your kindness. That setting boundaries isn't selfishness, but an act of dignity. And that in life, everyone must be responsible for their actions and decisions. So, while they faced their problems, I focused on rebuilding my life with the strength that only comes from overcoming betrayal and disappointment. It was a long and painful process, but every day I felt more in control of my destiny, more confident that I had made the best decision for myself. There came a time, after so many calls, messages, and pleas, when I had to be absolutely clear with myself and with them. I could no longer allow myself to continue living in that cycle where my kindness was taken for granted, where my efforts were taken for granted, and where my heart was torn apart again and again by people who, honestly, didn't deserve that sacrifice. So when they asked me once again to help them, to be their lifeline, their last hope, something in me broke for good. It wasn't a decision made in a fit of anger or resentment, but in a profound act of maturity, reflection, and, above all, self-love. I said no. It was the hardest word I've uttered in years, but also the most necessary. I did it firmly, with a serenity that can only come from having walked a path of pain and learning. I spoke to them respectfully, without reproach or tears, because I understood that it was no longer about punishing them, but about setting an unbreakable boundary, a line I wasn't willing to cross again. "I'm not here to fix what you broke," I told them, in a calm but forceful voice. "I'm not going to be the person who always fixes everything, while you continue to fail to value what I do or recognize my efforts. I've given so much, I've sacrificed more than anyone could imagine, but the time has come to put an end to this story." It was a moment of truth, of absolute clarity. There was no hatred in my words, no resentment disguised as harshness, but the conviction of someone who knows themselves, who knows their worth, and who refuses to be less than they are. I explained to them that my decision was not a punishment or revenge, but an act of dignity, a way to protect my space, my mental health, and my future. Because I understood that, in order to heal and move forward, I had to close that stage forever. Upon hearing my answer, I felt a shock in the silence that followed, a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and perhaps a glimmer of respect that had never existed before. But I was no longer seeking their approval or understanding. I was seeking my peace. I closed that door with the certainty that, even if it hurt, it was the best thing for me and for everyone. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye or an explosive breakup, but a serene and definitive farewell. A clear message that, from that moment on, things would change, that there would no longer be room for manipulation or emotional abuse, that everyone should bear the consequences of their actions, and that I was willing to walk my own path, free from the burdens of others. This decision marked a turning point in my life. It was the point where I stopped being the invisible person, the one who always gave in, and became someone who respects herself, who cares for herself, and who refuses to allow herself to be walked over. I learned that saying no isn't selfish, but the deepest expression of self-love and self-respect. I know it wasn't easy for them, nor for me, but that determination allowed me to heal, grow, and rebuild my life with authenticity and freedom. And although some wounds will take time to heal, I now know that every tear shed was worth it, because it led me to understand that my worth doesn't depend on what others decide or do, but on how I treat and defend myself. Thus, with that irrevocable decision, I closed a period that had been full of sacrifice, pain, and silence, to open another full of hope, dignity, and inner strength. And I say this to you who are listening or reading me now: never be afraid to set limits, to protect your peace, and to decide that you deserve so much more. Because sometimes, saying no is the first step toward saying yes to yourself. Betrayals don't always come with shouting matches or direct confrontations. Sometimes, betrayals come in white, with fake smiles and guest lists where your name simply doesn't appear. It's those silent betrayals, those invisible wounds that open in the soul when you least expect them, that hurt the most and usually leave a deep mark that is difficult to heal. Because it's not just the physical absence or the public rejection that hurts, but the feeling that your love, your time, and your efforts were completely ignored, as if they never had any value. I've learned that the true betrayal isn't in what they say to you, but in what they choose not to say, in what they choose not to share with you, in the fact that while you give everything, they act as if you were never there. And it's in those moments that you understand that family doesn't always mean unconditional support or reciprocal love. Sometimes, family is the source of the deepest wounds and the hardest lessons, because they are the ones who should protect us and instead teach us how to defend ourselves. But I have also discovered, through this painful experience, that recognizing your worth is the first step to healing. That setting clear and firm boundaries is not only necessary, but vital to preserving your dignity and emotional health. You can't continue opening doors to those who systematically close theirs, nor can you continue to be the support for those who don't make even the slightest effort to sustain you. Loving shouldn't mean losing yourself, or allowing your essence to be trampled on. Therefore, today I tell you, if you have ever felt that your love, your dedication, and your sacrifices were not reciprocated, that you have been left aside, or that you simply haven't been valued as you deserve, you are not alone. Don't allow that pain to make you close your heart, but let it give you the strength to be more selective with whom you choose to share your life. Don't ignore your own limits to maintain an inauthentic peace, or out of fear of breaking ties that no longer add to you, but only subtract from you. Value yourself. Take care of yourself. Learn to say no when necessary and to distance yourself when you are hurt, because you deserve respect, true love, and reciprocity. Nothing less. And even if the path is difficult and the pain intense, every step you take toward emotional freedom will be a personal triumph that will strengthen you and make you grow. I want you to know that you are not alone in this struggle, that there are many people who have gone through or are going through the same thing, and that sharing our stories is a powerful way to heal together. If you've ever felt like you gave more than you received, that you struggled in silence, and that no one appreciated your efforts, this is a space for you, to find solace and to remember that you deserve so much more. If this story resonated with you, if it somehow made you feel understood or gave you the strength to make difficult decisions, I invite you to subscribe. Here you will find true stories with unexpected twists, life lessons, and the courage we need to face family and personal challenges. You are not alone, and together we can learn to be stronger, to value ourselves, and to never settle for less than we deserve. Thank you for being here, for listening, and always remember that self-love is the greatest gift you can give yourself. Protect your peace, take care of your soul, and never allow anyone to make you feel less than you. Because you deserve all the good things life has to offer.